Meeting will come to order. Everybody take their seats. I'd like to start promptly. Good morning. We gathered in public session this morning to take testimony on the Air Force budget request for fiscal year 2015. I'd like to welcome on behalf of the committee Secretary Deborah Lee James in her first appearance before our subcommittee, and may I commend President Obama on making an excellent choice. You've had a lot of experience on the Hill and a lot of experience off the Hill, and we're highly appreciative of your role and new responsibilities. General Welsh is making his second appearance before the committee. General, welcome back, and may I say thank you for representing the best of America, the men and women of the United States Air Force, and a special thumbs up to the remarkable men and women who at Bagram Air Base do that air transport, the land stool. Any of us have been over that part of the world, and I know we're winding down there, but the transport of those individuals with serious injuries and the way and manner and the professional way it's done is truly remarkable. So I salute you. Air power is vital to the department's ability to project power globally and to rapidly respond to contingencies. The Air Force brings capabilities critical to national security in the air and the space, in cyberspace, and will continue to improve performance in each. We will incorporate next-generation equipment and concepts into the force to address sophisticated threats. Key priorities include continuing plans to field a new generation of combat aircraft and making advancements in cyber capabilities, avionics, weapons, tactics, and training. These are not my words. They come directly from the Quadrennial Defense Review, and they illustrate the tough decisions the Air Force will have to make balancing current readiness with future modernization. This committee also has some tough decisions to make in coming weeks, and this morning we're anxious to know from our witnesses where our Air Force is going with its nuclear mission, with the F-35 procurement, with the KC tanker program, with the combat rescue helicopter, the next generation JSTARS platform, the proposed long-range strike bomber, the role of UAVs, the competition between U-2 and Global Hawk, the high-altitude ISR and other military satellites, and the role and size of our Guard, Air Guard, and reserves. We must also seek your views on military modernization in China and the threats posed by the Russian Federation and what we call transnational terrorists. As the QDR said, and I quote, "Air power is vital," quote unquote, in defending America and America's interests. And we need to know how the Air Force is preparing itself to meet current and future threats in an increasingly dangerous world. I'd now like to recognize my ranking member, Mr. Visklosky, for any comments that he may make. But again, Madam Secretary, General Welsh, thank you for being with us. Mr. Visklosky.
Chairman, thank you very much for having the hearing today, and I want to thank the Secretary as well as General for your appearance and your service, and look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It will be put in the record. Thank you.
Huge honor and a privilege for me to serve as the 23rd Secretary of the Air Force, alongside our nearly 690,000 active duty Guard, Reserve, civilian airmen and their families. I have now been on the job for all of 3 months, and I want you to know that I have visited 18 bases in 13 states. In addition, I've just returned from a trip to the AOR, including stops at Kabul and Bagram, Kandahar, and Shindan. So I had those stops in Afghanistan, and I saw terrific airmen delivering crucial airspace and cyberspace capabilities across the U.S. Central Command. It was truly a phenomenal trip, and I was so proud to be among them, and I know many of you have visited with them as well overseas. And by the way, whenever I have visited a location, I've basically seen three things. I've seen leaders who are tackling tough issues at every level. I have seen every step of the way superb total force teamwork, so active guard, reserve, and civilian, but particularly active guard and reserve working seamlessly. And once again, it all comes down to those amazing and innovative and enthusiastic airmen who are so dedicated to their mission and to our nation. Now, Mr. Chairman, it's no secret to this committee that we are in challenging times, both in terms of our changing security environment as well as having a period of declining budgets. And so in the submission that we bring before you today, we have attempted to tackle these challenges head on, and we have tried to do it in a thoughtful and deliberate and inclusive way. So to make these tough choices, of course, we started with our strategy. It's a strategy for today: defending the homeland against all strategic threats, building security globally by projecting U.S. influence and deterring aggression, and standing ready to win decisively against any adversary should deterrence fail. So that's the mission of today. But we also have a mission for tomorrow. We need to invest in new technologies and platforms to take on new centers of power, as well as those old centers of power that sometimes are troublesome as well, and be prepared to operate in a much more volatile and unpredictable world, a world in which the American dominance of the skies and space can no longer be taken for granted. Now, your Air Force is crucial in all of these areas, but the trouble is the likely budget scenarios we face will leave us with gaps in the strategy that I've laid out. Now, I've been in the defense business for upwards of 30 years, and of course I know, as you know, that strategy and budgets never match exactly. There's always some mismatches, and those mismatches force us to make budget decisions, judgment calls, you might say, about where we want to assume the most prudent risks. I'll grant you, I think this year is probably more difficult than most that I have seen. And by the way, we are very grateful for the stability that we have and the additional bump up in resources that we received in FY14 and 15 and under the Bipartisan Budget Act and the Appropriations Act of fiscal 14. These laws didn't solve all of our ills. We're still faced with these difficult scenarios, but they were a great help, and we want to thank you for that. Our 15 budget does hit the budget targets, the dollar targets of the BBA, but it also contains something called the Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative. This is a $26 billion initiative across DoD, $7 billion of which is targeted for the Air Force. And if we are to receive it, it would go toward readiness and investment priorities that will help us close those gaps I told you about. So the bottom line is the budget in a 5-year plan is all about rebalancing. We're all about rebalancing readiness and future capability. It's not an either-or. We really need both. It's essential for our future. Now, I'd like to give you a quick overview of some of the major decisions, but put them in the framework of the 3 priorities that I have laid out for our Air Force. And those 3 priorities are taking care of people, balancing today's readiness with tomorrow's readiness, and ensuring that our Air Force is the most capable at the least cost to the taxpayer. So beginning with taking care of people, as far as I'm concerned, every job I've ever had, I've learned it always comes down to people, 100% of the time. So taking care of people to me means we need to recruit the right people, retain the right people. We need to develop them once we have them in the force. We need diversity of thought at the leadership table, diversity of background so that we make innovative decisions and solutions going forward. We need to protect the most important family programs. We need dignity and respect for all, and that includes combating sexual harassment and assault, and making sure that everybody in our Air Force is living the legacy and living our core values of integrity, service, and excellence all the time. It means fair compensation going forward for our Air Force. So all of this is taking care of people. Now let me zero in on 2 areas where we've had some controversy lately. First is force reductions. We are coming down in all of our components, active guard, reserve, and civilians, and we will rely more, not less, in the future on our guard and reserve. We think that's good sense, both from the mission standpoint as well as from the budgetary standpoint. But as we draw down, it's not good enough just to get lower numbers. We have to reshape the force. At the moment, on the active duty side, we have too many of certain types of career fields and too few of others. So we need to get in balance, and we're doing that through both voluntary and involuntary incentives. The second controversy has to do with compensation, where we are proposing to slow the growth in military compensation. We think there are reasonable ways to do this, and these are contained in our budget proposal, and it's across DoD. But this was one of those hard decisions that nobody is really happy with, but it's necessary to ensure that we free up some money to plow back into both the readiness of today as well as the modernization of tomorrow. That leads me to priority 2, which is balancing today's readiness and tomorrow's readiness. You're well aware that our readiness has suffered over the years, and particularly last year during the period of sequestration, where we had to ground flying squadrons and furlough civilians and delay maintenance and a whole host of other approaches. In FY15, we have fully funded our flying hours and other high-priority readiness issues. And if approved, we will see gradual improvements of readiness over time. It won't be overnight, it won't be in 1 year, but we'll be on a good path toward getting to where we need to be. At the same time, we're looking to tomorrow. So we do remain committed to those programs you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the F-35, the KC-46 tanker, the long-range strike bomber, and our triad, 2/3 of which, the bombers and the ICBMs, reside in our Air Force. So we are committed to all of this, and we are funding these going forward. We're also beginning to replace other aging platforms. As you mentioned, the Combat Rescue Helicopter. We've laid the groundwork for the next generation of J-STARS. We've laid the groundwork for the replacement of our trainer aircraft called the T-38. We want to invest in a new jet engine technology that promises reduced fuel consumption, lower maintenance, and will help the industrial base. Now, to pay for all of these investments, given the budgetary realities, we had to make some hard choices, and we have to accept some risk. So here we go. It's not popular, but here are some of the trade-offs that we chose to make. Retirement of the A-10 fleet and the U-2 fleet. Limiting the growth of combat air patrols to 55 instead of 65. And by the way, today we're at 50, so we would still be going up. We're just not going up as much. We would retire the MQ-1 over time in favor of an entire MQ-9 fleet. That, of course, is the Predator. Now, these are just a few examples of the trade-offs, but by making these choices today, we'll make sure that we don't end up getting bested in a contested environment in the future, and that is the kind of future that we are looking toward. And that leads me to my last priority, making every dollar count for the taxpayer. To me, this means keeping acquisition programs on budget, on schedule. It means auditability as a fundamental principle of our good stewardship. It means trimming our overhead in the Air Force, including that 20% headquarter reduction that the Secretary of Defense asked us to do, and we think we're going to do better than that. And by the way, I do want to join with our Secretary of Defense and ask you to approve another round of BRAC in 2017. I want to begin to wrap by telling you the very serious impacts we feel we would face if we have to revert to the sequestration level budgets in FY16 and beyond. We do not recommend this. We feel that it would compromise our national security too much. So if we return to sequestration level budgets, this would mean retiring up to 80 more aircraft, including the entire KC-10 tanker fleet, deferring sensor upgrades for Global Hawk, which would bring it up to parity with the U-2, retiring Global Hawk Block 40 fleet, slowing the purchases of the F-35, reducing our caps further of Predators and Reapers. We wouldn't be able to do that next generation engine technology I told you about, and we might have to relook the Combat Rescue Helicopter and a whole series of other things. So the bottom line is it's a bad deal for the Air Force, for the DoD, and the country, and we ask you to please support the higher levels of defense under the President's budget. I'll conclude, Mr. Chairman, by just offering you up my vision of the Air Force 10 years from now. It will be an Air Force which is smaller, but it will be an Air Force which is highly capable, innovative, and ready. We will be a good value in everything that we do for our taxpayers. We will be able to respond overseas decisively through unparalleled air power, and will also stand ready to defend here at home when disaster strikes. We'll be more reliant, not less, on our garden reserve. Again, it makes good sense to do so from a mission standpoint and from our taxpayer standpoint. And we will be powered by the very best airmen on this planet who live the culture of dignity and respect for all, integrity, service, and excellence. I want to thank all of you for what you do for our nation, and I will yield to General Welsh.
General Welsh, the floor is yours, and your entire statement will be put in the record, so if you could summarize it for us, that would be great.
Thank you, Chairman. I will do so. Sir, thank you, and Ranking Member Maslowski and members of the committee for allowing us to be here. It's always a privilege to appear before you. Ladies and gentlemen, your Air Force is the finest in the world, and we need to keep it that way. We built this budget to ensure that Air Force combat power remains unequaled, but that does not mean that it will remain unaffected. Every major decision reflected in this budget proposal hurts. Each of them reduced the capability that our combatant commanders would love to have and believe they need, and there are no more easy cuts. That's just where we are today. We simply can't ignore the fact that the law as currently written returns us to sequestered funding levels in FY16, so that's also considered as part of our plan. And to prepare for that, we must cut people and force structure now to create a balanced Air Force that we can afford to train and operate in FY16 and beyond. I will submit the rest of this oral statement for the record, sir. There's one thing I would like to walk through, though, because it highlights the very tough decisions that are having to be made. And let me say that because we needed to cut billions of dollars, not millions of dollars out of our budget, the normal trimming around the edges just wasn't going to get it done. And so we looked at cutting fleets of aircraft as a way to get to the significant savings that are required. And let me walk you briefly through that logic. In our air superiority mission area, we already have reductions in our proposal, but eliminating an entire fleet would leave us unable to provide air superiority for an entire theater of operations, and we are the only service that can do so. ISR is the #1 shortfall of our combatant commanders year after year. They would never support even more cuts than we already have in our budget proposal. We have several fleets of aircraft in the global mobility mission area. I actually spoke with Chief of Staff of the Army, Ray Odierno, to ask what he thought about reductions in our airlift fleet as we were going through this planning. And his view was that a smaller Army would need to be more responsive and able to move quicker. He did not think that reducing airlift assets further was a good idea, and the Secretary and I agree. We looked at our air refueling fleets and considered divesting the KC-10 as an option, just one example. But analysis showed us that the mission impact was too significant. But as the Secretary said, if we do return to sequestered funding levels in 2016, that option will have to be back on the table. We looked at the KC-135 fleet, but we would have to cut many more KC-135s than KC-10s to achieve the same savings. And with that many KC-135s out of the fleet, we simply can't meet our worldwide mission requirement. In the strike mission area, cutting the A-10 fleet would save us $3.7 billion across the FIDA and another $500 million in cost avoidance for upgrades that we wouldn't have to achieve. To get that same savings would require a much higher number of either F-15s, Es, or F-16s, but we also looked at those options. We ran a detailed operational analysis comparing divestiture of the A-10 fleet to divestiture of the B-1 fleet, to reducing the F-16 fleet, to reducing the F-15E fleet, to deferring procurement of a large number of F-35s to outside the FIDA, and to decreasing readiness by standing down a number of fighter squadrons and just parking them on the ramp. We used the standard DoD planning scenarios, and the results very clearly showed that cutting the A-10 fleet was the lowest risk option from an operational perspective. A bunch of bad options. And while no one is happy, especially me, about recommending divestiture of this great old friend, from a military perspective, it's the right decision. And it's representative of the extremely difficult choices that we're facing in the budget today. The funding levels we can reasonably expect over the next 10 years dictate that for America to have a capable, credible, and viable Air Force in the mid-20s, we must get smaller now. We must modernize our force, but we can't modernize as much as we'd like to. And we must maintain the proper balance across all of our mission areas, because that's what the combatant commanders expect from us. Thank you for your continued support of our Air Force, and my personal thanks for your unending support of our airmen and their families. And the Secretary and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, General Welsh, and thank you both for your testimony. Before recognizing Vice Chairman Granger for the first line of questioning, but 4 of us on this panel were in the Air Force's capable hands as we traveled to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Qatar, and Jordan. And hats off to Colonel Sam Grable and Major George Nichols, who are with you or stand behind you today for their assistance It was wings up all the way, no problems. So we're highly appreciative. I had to wait until Mr. Moran showed up before I gave this kudos, but he's loyal and true and did show up, so I could do it with in a show of unity. Ms. Granger.
Thank you very much. Secretary James and General Welsh, thank you for what you're doing, and we really are anxious to hear more details about the enormous demands that you have before us and decisions. But before we do that, I'd like you to spend a few minutes. A year ago, with the FY14 Air Force budget hearing, it was really turned into a hearing on the Air Force sexual assault because of the terrible acts of one officer here in Washington. And at that time, a lot was said about zero-tolerance policies within the Air Force and heightened screening for new recruits. I'd like you to take just a few minutes to talk about the success of your Special Victims Counseling Program, but also tell us what steps have been taken to help weed out perpetrators before they enter your service, and what's happening at the academies, and how you address Secretary Hagel's directive requiring additional screening of sexual assault coordinators and recruiters and military training instructors, and bring us up to speed on that.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Granger. First of all, I want you to know I am fully committed to this, as is the chief, and we are both working this hard. So, for example, I told you all this travel I've been doing. Everywhere I go, I meet privately with the SARCs, I meet with the Special Victims Councils, I meet with victims advocates, sort of one-on-one to kind of get their point of view about how things are going on the location, in the location where they are serving. And my overall feeling is that we are making progress. We are making progress in getting the force more comfortable, believing that reporting is a good thing. And indeed, our reports are up over the last year on the order of about 33%. We don't yet know about the incidents. We'll know that at the end of December 2014, so the end of this year, we'll have more data on the incidents. Of course, what we want is we want reports up and incidents down, ultimately. Now, as to the Special Victims Council program, I think it's been a tremendous success. We are ramping it up a little bit as we go forward, and as you know, they're spreading it now across the Department of Defense because it has been so successful. It's given victims more confidence. Additionally, it has helped to turn some restricted reports into unrestricted reports. And as everybody knows, the key difference there is when a victim makes a restricted report, they can get care and counseling and help, but we don't get told anything, and therefore it can't be investigated. So to turn these types of reports into unrestricted, where they can be investigated and something can be done about it, of course, is a tremendous help. And the Special Victims Council has done that as well. As far as trying to root out predators from our system, we're looking at a number of ideas. We're trying to learn as much as we can from the civilian sector and from civilian research to see if we can come up with a better knowledge about profiles of people, to recognize people in advance. That's one idea that we're working on. Another idea is to look at the questions that we ask new entrants into the Air Force. You know, we ask many questions about conduct and health and all sorts of questions. We're wondering if there might not be additional questions that, you know, depending on the answers, that could root out predators. So these are just some ideas we're working on it. Don't have anything solid to recommend at this point.
Only one or two things to add, ma'am. First of all, the Secretary mentioned this idea of sexual victims councils helping people transition from restricted to unrestricted reports. This is really a big deal. It's allowed us to move forward with prosecutions that we could not have in the past by getting victim support for an investigation, which as you well know, is a difficult thing for a lot of reasons. The victims used to transition at about a 13% rate in the past from unrestricted to restricted. Those who have special victims councils now over the past year have transitioned at an almost 50% rate, which allows us to move forward with many more cases and get to whatever the right outcome is. The second thing I would mention is that there are lots of things that go into this increased confidence we believe we're seeing and willingness to report. We put new investigation training programs into place for all of our OSI investigators. We have new special prosecutors who've been trained in a different way now. All the services are pursuing the same approach. We have gotten, our prosecution rates have doubled in the last 2 years. Now, prosecution isn't the goal. The right outcome is the goal, but if we investigate better, we should prosecute more. All that will contribute to increased confidence. Our conviction rates are up. There have been lots of positive trends. None of that's good enough. We have to continue the trends, accelerate the trends, figure out where the other game-changing approaches are, and keep charging toward the only acceptable number, which is 0.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Granger. Mr. Moran.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for recognizing these two stalwart Air Force personnel. They were terrific, as I'm sure all of their colleagues are. General and Secretary, this subcommittee has, relatively speaking, been pretty supportive of the F-35. And it's a great plane. But I think we would be remiss if we did not raise questions over a fleet that the most recent cost estimate is going to cost us $1 trillion. It's a lot of money, and so the underlying question is how can we afford it? But let me ask some specific questions that we need to get on the record, because the decision, Madam Secretary, is to concurrently test and produce the F-35 has led to a number of problems that are kind of unprecedented in terms of the procurement process. For example, we have issues with regard to onboard safety. I'm going to mention a number of these, and you can pick and choose which ones you want to address, but we have a system that's supposed to prevent explosions after a fuel tank is hit by a bullet, and that's defective. We can't seem to be able to stop fires that are caused by lightning strikes. So we wonder, is this going to cause a roadblock to production? Then we have the helmet-mounted display that has not done well in testing, and the pilots are saying that it causes spatial disorientation resulting from the jitter and the latency issues of the display. Again, is that a fatal flaw? And then we are told that the distributed aperture system, you have these 6 infrared cameras that track the incoming missiles, it has failed in its most basic function as a missile warning and defense system, and now can't tell the difference between incoming missiles and the system's own decoy flares. Again, we're concerned about this. And then, most recently, we were told that performance concerns have led to the imposition of severe training restrictions on the F-35. Training squadrons are prohibited from night flights, supersonic flights, and flights in bad weather, particularly when there's any possibility of lightning. They're prohibited from dropping live ordnance or firing the aircraft's guns while training. So again, those kinds of restrictions cause some real concerns about achieving our training objectives. You may want to defer on some of this to General Welsh, but these are the concerns about a program that's going to cost the taxpayers $1 trillion when all is said and done. Can you address at least some of them, Madam Secretary and General Welsh?
Yes, I will. I'll start, Congressman Moran, and then, as you say, General Welsh can also chime in. So, number one, I totally agree with you about the money, and it's an enormous amount of money, and there's a variety of pieces to this, of course, and I think that $1 trillion figure, which is just so enormous, also goes to the 50 years of operations and sustainability and whatnot. So in terms of trying to be on top, we are where we are, right? So the overruns have occurred, and there's nothing that I or General Welsh can do about that past history, but the future is ours. So as you heard me say, I want to be on top of this as best as I can. So I've already met probably 4 times with the program manager on this, General Bogdan. I've been out to Edwards, I've been to Eglin, I've talked to the pilots, I've looked at the helmet, I've been exposed to many of these things that you mentioned. I've sat down with the head of Lockheed Martin, and I've specifically talked to her about some of these key concerns. So we're on it, and particularly with respect to sustainability, we recognize that bending that cost curve, breaking that cost curve is going to be so crucial as we go forward. This issue of concurrency, you just put your finger on it. It is a devilishly difficult thing to be doing all of this at once. Again, that decision was made years ago, and we are where we are. The other person I'm sticking close to is Mr. Gilmore, Dr. Gilmore, the head of independent operational test and evaluation, because he frequently has a slightly different point of view than the program office. I think it's very important to hear both of those points of view. So I will just tell you that we're on all of these things. The program office feels like, given where we are in the program, that we're still going to meet the IOC dates within reason. There's some slippages up to 6 months on one of the software development areas that the program office is predicting, but within reason for something this complex, they feel like we are going to be reasonably on time for that IOC.
You're still talking about the IOC of 2016.
That's right. Right. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, Congressman, let me start by saying that I'm confident that we're going to be IOC in 2016, as is Lieutenant General Bogdan, as I think is the contractor leadership team for the program. A couple of quick things. The fuel tanks, the lightning strike concerns, those aren't new concerns, as you know, sir. Those have been a problem for a while. Those fixes are actually coming into place now. The airplane is starting to fly more. In fact, you mentioned the helmet and the DAS system. The airplane flew at night for the first time down at Eglin Air Force Base on Monday night. The flight went fantastic. I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but this is very close from a note from the squadron commander who flew the sortie. His note to his boss said, well, my big takeaway is that we're not going to have big issues flying at night. The DAS system worked phenomenally well. The helmet worked great. The only issue he had is when he turned the DAS system off, there was a little bit of a green glow in the mask. It was a little bit distracting to him. He said, but this is just not an issue. And the DAS system operated superbly for him at night. So the software issues that will allow us to not get the DAS confused by different inputs, whether they're airplane flares or a ground launch, that will allow them to utilize their full suite of weapons have not been completed yet. Those are part of the development process. The airplane's performance has been on track since 2011. We follow it very closely. I'm in touch with the Lockheed Martin leadership team, with the PEO team, with the folks in the field. The Secretary and I have both visited both Eglin, where our training program is, and Edwards, where our test program is, within the last month. We're paying an awful lot of attention to this, sir, and I'm actually more confident than I've ever been, and that we will reach IOC. There will be software issues. Beyond that is where those software issues start to be a problem in getting the full operational capability of the airplane finalized before FOC.
Well, that's new and encouraging information that your first night flight was this Monday. Thank you. I didn't know that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have a keen interest, obviously, in this project. Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got just 3 quick questions, 2 about light air support and 1 about our space launch program. I think, as you all know, we've got a lot of our international partners that they can't buy and maintain big jet aircraft, and so we have these light air support that we help them, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Philippines. Secretary James, could you just give us an update on how, are we doing any foreign military sales other than those 3 countries on these light air support? Number 1, just a kind of a update on that program, and 2, how does it work when somebody requests those kind of aircraft? Do we open up competition in our country to provide those? Give us a little overview of that.
So, sir, the light air support, the A-29 issue that I'm most familiar with, again, I was just over in Afghanistan, does pertain to the training of the Afghan Air Force. And so I think we are quite close to sort of finalizing a proposed way forward, and we're really waiting on General Dunford and his negotiations with the Afghan government on that. There has been competition in that program, of course, and other countries do currently use the A-29, but I believe it is not in our inventory. So to the extent, it depends on where we're going to do this training of the Afghan pilots and Afghan maintainers, but of course we have a process in the Air Force. Once we get the go-ahead, we would launch our normal process to try to figure out where that training would occur.
You know, there was some talk that maybe, I mean, we spent a lot of money in Afghanistan training the pilots and the folks that are involved in those aircraft, and since nobody knows exactly what's going to happen politically, whether we're going to have any troops there or not, is there talk about training those Afghan pilots, bringing them to the United States and doing training? And if so, is that any concern to you in terms of security? Get an update on that?
So there is discussion about this, and this is what we're sort of awaiting the final discussions that General Dunford is having. But that is a possibility. And of course, the Air Force has a process, if you will, to try to decide when a new mission like that comes along, where to put it. And that's what we're working through. And as I mentioned, I think we're getting close.
And the last quick question is, the military space launch, the EELV program, and as I understand it, the United Launch Alliance, they provided all the launch services, and you're going to open up that to competition to other companies. And are you going to make sure that, I mean, since you've had one group doing everything, when you open up the competition, the question becomes making sure it's a level playing field. How are you going to ensure the new entrants have the kind of the background expertise that all things are going to be considered?
Right. So on the EELV program, the way I'll describe it, and this is, making it very simple, but it's the way I can sort of remember it and talk it. You have different types of launches of different payloads. So I'll say there's sort of heavier launches, and then there's lighter launches in terms of the weight. So right now, we are interested, and we're trying to aggressively get more competition. We think that'll be good for all of us. It'll bring our costs down. But the key thing is to make sure that the people are qualified, as you said, as you bring new entrants in. So there is this qualification process where new entrants have to demonstrate that they can actually do a certain number of launches. They have to share their engineering data with the Air Force just to make sure that they are qualified. We think if all goes well, again, if it all goes well, we will have new entrants qualified for those lighter launches, maybe as early as the end of the year. And eventually, some years from now, I think the target is 2017, if all goes well, we would have new entrants qualified to do the heaviers as well. So the point is, we're on a glide path to get more entrants qualified so that we can have competition. So that's kind of the road we're on. At the moment, ULA is the only one that is qualified to do any of these launches.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Crenshaw. Ms. McCollum.
Thank you. I appreciated in your testimony you talked about 100% as personnel, because you can have all the equipment in the world, but if you don't have good personnel to use it, you don't have much of anything. And balance. So I want to talk about something that really caught our eye in the office. It's from Defense News, March 24th, and it's Air Force engineer shortage. The Air Force Chief Scientist Ensley recently commented that the U.S. Air Force is facing a perfect storm of personnel issues that's endangering retention and recruitment of engineers. And we know how important it is to have good, science and driving innovation, technology breakthroughs. So a shortage is very concerning. And this shortage is both an active duty and civilian, according to this article. It goes on to say that the article goes on to say that the main shortage isn't a lack of science and technology funding in the budget, but it's uncertainty. With sequestration still looming and 2016 government shutdown, civilian pay freezes, there seems to be a lot of disincentive for young engineers to choose the Air Force over a job in the private industry. It goes on to point out, that we don't have the enhanced graduate tuition that many of the private sector industries that we're competing for these young men and women in, let alone the inability to attend scientific conferences where you can interact with people and move towards to have your work published in the future if you're a scientist. So I want to know what kind of steps are being taken to prevent further erosion, and how, as we members of this committee, help with the recruitment and retain top scientists, and what do we need to do to be crystal clear that travel abuses will not be tolerated, but at the same time expedite a way in which you can get people to attend top conferences so that we can retain. And I do have another question, so if you could just kind of briefly answer that.
So I think you're dead right. I think science, technology, engineering, and math in general is very difficult to recruit and retain, because they can, those folks can write their own ticket. I'll go you one better. They're hard for the defense industry. I come out of the defense industry. SAIC was my company, and we had a tough time recruiting and getting such people into our workforce. They wanted to go into other forms of high tech. Defense was not seen nearly as cool as it once was. So it's a hard problem, and you add cyber on top of that, and it's very difficult. I don't have any specific solutions to suggest at this point. We do have a series of, bonuses and things of this nature that we utilize throughout the course of recruiting and retaining to make sure that we try to balance the force. I would also say that when it comes to the TDYs and so forth, we took a very hard line during the year of sequestration on that. I think you're going to see, hopefully, some easing of that. So that will naturally get a little bit more eased, I believe.
If you have some ideas, and if you could get back to us. I'd like to go to my second question, but first I'd like to comment. Ms. Granger is right on, and our committee is lockstep, wanting to do whatever we can do to work on the issue of sexual assault and have it down, as you said, to zero. But Mr. Crenshaw, I want to expand on what he was talking about, the launch program. Another issue that's arisen in recent weeks is the use of Russian-made RD-180 engines in the Atlas V rockets that launch our military satellites. It's my understanding that ULA has exclusive agreement with a Russian company that manufactures this particular engine. I believe, that we should be concerned that heavily reliant on these engines at a time when our country is imposing sanctions against Russia for its actions in the former area of Ukraine, the Crimea. So how well do the RD-80 engines perform? And I know Secretary Hagel is asking the Air Force to review this matter. Could you please comment what your assessment is on this and when it will be complete for this committee?
So I share the worry, and as you mentioned, we have launched a review. By the end of May or so, we expect to have the results of that review, which will be looking at risks, costs, how might we do it in the United States, things of this nature. I will say this, this partnership, if you will, has been in existence for years. It has weathered various storms that we've had in the U.S.-Russian relationships. That doesn't mean I'm not worried about it. I am, but I'm just trying to say we've seen ups and downs before. I also want to tell you that that ULA does have, I'm told, a 2-year supply of these engines already on hand. I've learned a lot from my trip to the AOR. Having the equipment is one thing, but do you also have the spare parts? So we're looking into that just in case there's any other hitches out there. But what I'm hearing right now is at least for the next 2 years, no matter what, we're in okay shape. But it is worrying, and by the end of May, we should have our review done.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. McCollum. Mr. Calvert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of quick questions. One, obviously, Madam Secretary, you and the General spent some time going over what capabilities must be cut in order to meet future budget obligations, and those are difficult decisions to make. But right now, the United States has 1.3 million active duty military personnel versus 770,000 civilian personnel. And the Defense Business Board recommended that defense civilian reductions go back to the 2003 levels, or 15%, whichever is greater. And if we go back in history, in 2003, we had 1.4 million active duty personnel versus 636,000 civilian personnel. So we've had a significant increase in civilian personnel relative to military personnel. We had an actual reduction in military personnel and a substantial increase in civilian military personnel. What do you think is a reasonable ratio? We're talking about a big number here. To bring that number back into the conformance or ratio that it has been previously would save $165 billion over 10 years. And we're talking about significant capability cuts, both to in-strength, especially in the Army, Marine Corps, obviously platforms, and we have, I believe, a civilian workforce that is out of whack. What do you believe is a reasonable ratio here? And what are you prepared to do about it?
So, Mr. Calvert, I don't have a particular ratio to offer up, but I will just make a couple points, if I may. We are coming down in our civilian personnel. The numbers that we put forth were very sort of judiciously figured out in terms of, according to certain missions and reorgs and 20% headquarter reductions and things like that. So our numbers add up to a total that was specifically developed rather than across the board.
According to your comptroller, it's going to be less than 5%. Less than 5% of civilian personnel will be touch through this process, and yet we're going to be cutting the in-strength of the United States Army by 15%, and the United States Marine Corps by more than 10%. And just through your own testimony, we're removing several weapons platform and talking about parking air wings on the ramp.
Right.
What do you think is more appropriate, reducing civilian employees to a more proportionate level, or ending, troop strength and aircraft and the rest?
So we want to scrub it as much as possible, but most of our civilians are involved with our depots, supporting our
I'm
guard.
not talking about depots or wrench turners or that. I mean, we have the biggest growth in the military in the civilian workforce has not been that. It's been in folks in middle management and various occupations. We have support from former comptrollers, former senior defense managers, many others who believe that the growth within the civilian workforce has gone out of bounds. And there's not anything you can do about it, because under the work rules, you're not able to do reduction in force, performance reviews, and the rest. And we have a number of people that are up for retirement. So I hope you take a good look at this, because it seems to me that we ought to be looking at that versus removing necessary capability from the United States Air Force. One other quick question. It was brought up, these EELVs, and incumbents, and I understand this. We all love Lockheed and Boeing and ULA, but they guard their contracts very judiciously. I understand that. But competition is important. And we need to take a close look at that, because we need to allow these new entrants to compete. And let's face it, the military has been, over the history of the United States military, I'll just mention the Air Force, slow, for instance, to accept UAVs as a capable alternative to what was traditional aircraft. And I know you've changed that point of view, but it was a slow acceptance of new technology. And so we need to have an open mind and look at those technologies, and if they're capable, then accept it and save the taxpayer some money.
I think you'll have to take that as a statement firmly held by Mr. Calvert, perhaps by others. Thank you, Mr. Calvert. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary James, you mentioned that we need to rely more on our Air Guard and Reserve, and I appreciate that comment. We have a local Air Reserve base in Youngstown that has C-130s there. As you know, it's the workhorse of the Air Force, and several of those were taken away. This budget divests another C-130 from the Youngstown Air Reserve Station, losing one backup C-130, which takes us down to just 8 C-130s. My concern is that we are hurting the mission at reserve bases like Youngstown by subjecting them to a death by 1,000 cuts. We are the only fixed-wing aerial spray unit as well in the DoD, but Youngstown isn't the only base losing backup aircraft C-130Hs. From looking at a copy of the Air Force summary of PB-15 adjustments, I see many bases are losing and being divested of their backup aircraft C-130Hs. Can you tell me where those planes are going in general as well, what the rationale behind those moves are, and what the long-range plan for the Air Force's fleet of C-130s is?
I will begin, sir, by telling you that the validated requirements, the military has validated requirements, and we budget against those. For tactical airlift, we currently have too much in the way of C-130s. So overall, the decision in this tough budget environment was to bring that down so that it's closer to the validated requirement. As to what planes went where and so forth, I would yield to the chief to elaborate.
Sir, the plan for the overall plan for the balance between the active and reserve components has been developed over the last year. We're about halfway through the proposals that we are going to put in place. We have done some detailed analysis that we'd love to share with you by weapon system on ratios between active and reserve components. And then within the reserve components, the Air Guard and the Air Force Reserve, working with the National Guard Bureau, have worked with the tags to figure out what is the best way to balance those things. When you talk about 1 or 2 C-130s coming out of a unit, it's so they can make units across the Guard and Reserve the same size. They want to provide a consistent template for support equipment, for everything they do to support the fleet. And they thought that was the best way to balance those aircraft. And so we can come give you the details on all those moves if you'd like. I'll tell you what our 15 budget also shows if you look carefully. Because we're only halfway through this, we haven't balanced all the force structure across the active and reserve component. The guidance from the beginning has been put as much as we can into the reserve components. If we can become more efficient and remain operationally capable, why would we not do that? So we are pushing everything we can by aircraft type, because that's the way you have to do the analysis, into the reserve component. We're about 60% through that analysis. We'll finish the rest this year. We've done it with the Air Guard, the reserve, the active duty sitting side by side, using the same cost models, the same decision support tools. And we've had tags in the planning process with us. And when we have a POM brief to the Secretary to make these decisions, those representative tags are sitting in the room and have a voice at the table. We're trying hard to get this right. The cut in the Air Guard manpower for this next year, 400 people versus 17,000 in the active component.
Mr. Chairman, if the gentleman would yield
Be
for a
happy to
second.
yield.
I heard what you said about you wanted every air reserve to look balanced. We have one in Minnesota that draws a lot from pilots that fly out of the Humphrey Airport and the International Airport. And what I've heard from those pilots for retraining them in the reserve is how far that they're going to have to drive and how much time that they're going to have to take off to go to other places if it closes. So I hope you're surveying where your pilots are and you're talking to the pilots to make sure that while you're just looking at this someone here on paper, that we aren't shortchanging ourselves for pilot retention in the reserve in the long run, because those folks have a choice whether or not they stay in or go out, and they're flying full-time, and they're doing this on off hours. And if we start adding more time into them going and getting the training, they're telling me they're considering leaving.
And the Reserve and Guard are bringing all those discussions to the table. I hope they're talking to the pilots in Minneapolis. I'll make sure they are. But the bottom line for all this in the budget is we are getting smaller.
Mr. Ryan, I know your time is about up since
Gonna
some of
punish
it was
my
claimed by our
generosity, Mr.
colleague,
Chairman.
but there's a keen interest in this issue here.
Just real
Yeah,
quick.
go ahead,
So
fire
you're
away.
saying that there is a more detailed account than the PB aircraft changes that we have here?
What I'm saying is that there's a reason all those changes are being made. We will be happy to come and talk to you.
Yeah,
We'll bring the Guard and the Reserve and sit down and tell you the story.
Okay, and you think 8 is about the number you want to have at each of the different bases?
That's the footprint they were looking at, is 8. And as they balance the fleet, that's what they did. Some of these airplanes are older, take more to maintain, so they're trying to centralize the places where they can be most efficient in maintaining the fleet over time.
Okay.
Love to have you all come in.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ryan. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank both of you for being here, and thank both of you honestly for, I think very politely, but making the appropriate point that you're making a lot of tough decisions because the Congress hasn't really made very tough decisions in terms of what we're going to do fiscally, and we're forcing a lot of that down on you. And that's something that I've said repeatedly just to keep reminding ourselves, and I know this committee feels very strongly about this. We don't deal with our entitlement crisis. We don't deal with the bigger fiscal issues in front of us. We're going to keep taking out of the hide of the American military, and that's got a lot of costs and risks associated with it. And I know you're both making decisions you don't like to make, and that you probably wouldn't make, frankly, in different circumstances. I do want to pick up on a point that Mr. Ryan made and asked about a specific concern, and I'll admit right up front it's shamelessly parochial. That's the, I'll be like Ryan, shamelessly parochial. But I think appropriately so, because he did make the point, and you did make the point, General Welsh, that we're going to rely more on reserve capability than we have in the past, and we're fortunate to have those folks. But you know, we're also going to eliminate 7 AWACS, and they're the entire reserve capability that we have in that area. I mean, they're just going to be gone. And that's a low-density, high-use asset. We're using them right now, as you know, in Europe to try and send a message to the Russians. So I worry about the loss of that capability, particularly the reserve component of it. So could you walk us through, insofar as you can, the decision to do that, and explain to me why it might be wiser to actually put more of the active fleet in reserve and lower the cost that way, as opposed to actually lose the capability?
Yes, sir. The decision and the recommendation that we have on the AWACS is actually not based on that. It's based on this balancing of capability today versus modernization and capability 10 years from now. As a platform-based force, you understand we have to invest now to have a capability in the mid-20s that's viable against the threat we expect then. The AWACS is getting old. We have got to recapitalize it somehow. Within the Air Force budget, the only option we could come up with to modernize that fleet was to eat some of the aircraft to pay for the modernization of the command and control mission area. We completely understand it means accepting more risk over the near term. And our combatant commanders aren't going to like that either. But if they want a capability in 2023 and beyond, we have to do something now. If they're willing to not have a capability and just let the AWACS fleet time out or limp along in the mid-20s, which I don't think anybody's interested in, then we do nothing. So this is about creating investment money to recapitalize the command and control system.
I understand the rationale perfectly well, and I think you're very wise not to count on us to do the right thing. But I also think, and you know, this is just a theoretical discussion here, that probably with sequestration looming, there's going to have to be some sort of a big-time deal in this place between the administration and the Congress, probably sometime early next year, in the first quarter of the year. And that might, because we're not going to go through cuts of that magnitude, in my view. I just don't think they're sustainable. And again, I appreciate you, Madam Secretary, bringing that up and pointing that out, how critical that will be if we get past that point, because I think we're a lot further down this road than anybody a year or two ago thought we were going to be. I know certainly Congress never thought we were going to get to sequestration, and we did. And I know that for a long time the administration didn't. So we now know we're playing with live bullets that have real consequences for our military. But I do think we can avoid that. So you know, I'm going to be looking for ways, if there are ways, because I think keeping that capability is really a force multiplier for us and for our allies, a lot of whom simply don't have that capability and actually rely on us to provide it at a critical time. I've got other questions, but I'll reserve for another round. And again, thank both of you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Womack,
Thank
thanks
you.
for your patience.
My compliments to the Secretary and to the Chief for their great work. I have and I'll admit I was hopelessly, shamelessly, however you referred to it, parochial about A-10s once upon a time, and I've got an A-10 question that only demands just a brief answer. We're going to retire the fleet, but are we not investing more money in these A-10s, wing replacement? I assume the A-10C variant that's complete. I don't know for sure, but do we continue to invest in platforms like the A-10 that we are targeting for elimination, and why?
Congressman, the ones we would continue to invest in, even if it was approved to divest the fleet, would only be to keep the airplane viable through the end of its service life. We don't completely divest the fleet till 2019 under our plan. So if there's anything required to keep the fleet viable till then, we would continue to invest in that. We would not invest in buying additional kits for upgrades that would happen beyond that point, or to upgrade airplanes that we plan to divest over the next couple of years.
Now I'll be shamelessly parochial about the Reaper mission. Can you kind of walk me through the Air Force's plans long-term on Reaper? I know there have been some targeted numbers of procurement that have been reduced, but where are we in this process?
Yes, sir. We are right now we have 50 orbits of Predators plus Reapers. Our game plan is to migrate all the Predators, which are an older system, essentially the Wright Flyer of remotely piloted aircraft. That airplane has been fantastically good for us, but it doesn't have the capability that the MQ-9 Reaper does. And so we'll transition our entire Predator fleet to Reapers. As we do that, the Predator fleet will go away. Our intent was to grow originally to a department-established requirement of 65 combat air patrols. That's been modified down to 55, which will allow us to use some of that money we save in that regard to start recapitalizing the rest of the ISR enterprise. What the rest of the combatant commanders need and want is not 55 orbits of Reapers. But the plan right now is to continue with the Reaper plan that we currently have on track to include bed down at Fort Smith.
Yeah, in the Fort Smith area, they're having, in this transition period, they're engaging the FAA on airspace related information. Is the Air Force having any problem at all with the FAA on airspace issues related to, say, unmanned aerial aircraft?
I wouldn't call it a problem. I think this is something the FAA is doing their due diligence on for very good reasons. We're working closely with the FAA in places like Grand Forks, North Dakota, to figure out how do you manage multiple types of remotely piloted aircraft in the same airspace, something we need to do before the FAA will feel comfortable mixing unmanned aircraft with commercially piloted aircraft. And so I think that's the push for the future. And the effort is ongoing, and we need to continue it.
My last question is directed to the Secretary, and it's just a general question. You know, my friend Mr. Cole talked about how the Congress is having a hard time recognizing and wrapping its arms around the real problem driving the deficits and the debt that affect our country today, and that's basically pensions and health care. And at a smaller level, not an insignificant level, but at a smaller level, it's affecting the five-sided building too, pensions and health care. Madam Secretary, what is your recommendation to the Secretary, to the President, on how we harness this growing problem where so much of our money that would be available for the platforms that we're talking about cutting in the end strength and the force structure are now going toward the mandatory side of the Pentagon spending, as it is in our country?
So, Congressman Womack, I do think the proposals in our budget with respect to compensation are reasonable. Again, it's slowing the growth. We have had substantial growth in the last 12 or 13 years, and thank you to all of you who supported it, by the way, because we were able to, over that time, catch up military personnel to the equivalents in the private sector. And indeed, I think in some cases we've exceeded those comparability statistics. So thank you for that, but I think we're now at a point, given that our recruiting is strong, our retention is strong. As you heard me say, we're offering incentives for people in some cases to leave the service. Given that environment, we can afford to take a little bit of a risk and slow that growth in compensation. So that's point one. As far as the retirement is concerned, you know, there's, of course, the commission. They're due to report in something like 9 or 10 months. DOD has submitted some ideas but has not recommended one idea over the other. But everybody that I'm aware of, certainly in DOD and the administration, has put forth the important principle that when it comes to any retirement reforms, that people currently in the force and people currently retired should be grandfathered, and that any sort of reforms should apply to new young people who have not yet entered the force. So that's sort of a principle that we're all behind. But in totality, I think we do need to get control of some of these costs, and to do it judiciously is the way to go.
Thanks, Mr. Womack.
Just to make a quick
go right ahead.
On a hopeful note, that's exactly what Congress did, actually, in the Ryan Murray deal. That initial proposal, reaction was negative, but we retained, you know, for new people, that would be the standard, but we would not obviously hurt those currently serving, so I agree with you.
Thank you, Mr. Visconsi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions about what is not contained in the 2015 budget. In the administration's budget, the 15 request is within, if you would, the agreed cap, for lack of a better term. But the proposed 5-year period thereafter does not accept sequestration and adds an additional $116 billion above sequestration levels. Are there items that are not contained in the 15 budget that are contained in that $116 billion that I consider a very speculative figure? It should be in 15 on the theory the 116 you're never going to see it.
So with respect to the FY15 budget...
I don't want to be a downer. I'm just trying to be realistic here.
Right. So with respect to the FY15 budget, the way I would describe it is, with the exception of that $7 billion I told you, which is in that opportunity security piece, you know, part of the $26 billion, that's kind of, I'll say, over and above the targets laid out in the BBA. But other than that, everything we testified to is in the FY15 budget.
Right.
FY16 and beyond, that list that I gave you, we retire the KC-10 and the Global Hawk Block 40 and so forth. These are all things that if we don't get that president's budget level, we would have to strip out.
Do gentlemen yield?
Yes, sir.
The issue here is we're pushing a lot of things to the right here. And I went through the shopping list. Some of that may be on whatever this list is that's been put out by the Defense Department. But there are a lot of things we're sort of putting off here. Combat rescue, JSTARS platform. And, and there's some question as to, in the final analysis, whether we're going to ever, whether these programs are ever going to see the light of the day. I sort of like to sort of know where you are on that. But we're pushing a lot of things deliberately to the right here, which
That's
removes
true.
perhaps the possibility, since this is all about, this is a defense posture hearing, that we might not have something which is actually essential to us.
Chairman, I think that's kind of the point of our budget submission. Everything does hurt. Now, everything. It has a major impact on us. Divesting the A-10 fleet has a major impact. Divesting U-2s has a major impact. Trying to figure out how to recapitalize AWACS and JSTARS by eating part
And to look ahead towards a long-range bomber. I mean,
Yes, sir. But all those things are included, even if we stay at sequestered levels through the FIDEP, the things I just mentioned stay in there. There are some other things the Secretary mentioned that will have to come out because we just won't be able to afford them.
thanks for yielding.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the chairman probably asked my question a lot better than I did. And Madam Secretary, I don't think I'm asking the question properly because I didn't understand your answer, and I'm not blaming you, I'm blaming me. I guess my question, and it gets back to the chairman talking about things going to the right, is you mentioned the $7 billion for the Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative. The idea that this Congress is going to do entitlement reform and tax change, I think, is very speculative. So you got a $7 billion request there, and there's $116 billion department-wide for the next 5 years, on the theory that sequestration is not going to happen. I guess my question is, within those requests, because of the speculative nature of them, should some of those be shifted to the left for 15 and have gone unrequested in the 15 budget?
So the FY15 budget that we have placed before you is our best judgment. So I would say we made our judgment calls, and we would stand by what is in that FY15 budget. Now, of course, Congress, I believe, did invite us to submit, and we're putting together an unfunded priority list. But as you said, these things would be over and above the dollar figures which are likely. But if I could maybe say, as one summary point, we recognize that sequestration is the law of the land, and so we've given over budget judgments that reflect those dollar figures. But at the same time, we're using our bully pulpit to tell all of you as much as we can that we believe we need more. And that's why we are urging the approval of these higher levels. And we're trying to, in effect, tell you the judgments at the low level, how we would do it, and we're telling you what we really need at that higher level. So we've sort of given it to you two ways with the urgent request that we have that higher level.
So if the gentleman will yield, so the long-range bomber is something which has been pointed to as something we need. We know what we have. Some of it is pretty ancient. Is that a top priority for you?
Yes, it is.
And it's funded through the FIDEP, sir.
I'm done, Mr. Chair.
Reclaiming a little time. Be a little bit parochial. I follow, obviously, the good work of McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, the work they do and have done, obviously, with other Air Force bases to allow us to have the degree of success we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. What happens with those tankers, just incredible things that they do that often people don't recognize. Those crews and the ability to sustain the effort over there is I think, at times miraculous. So I give them and others in that part of your Air Force special credit. We talked before the hearing a little bit so this isn't coming out of left field. This is a defense posture hearing. Where do you see our, I don't like to use the term adversaries at times around here. We're careful about the words we choose, but where do you see China going in terms of its modernization and its readiness? Where do you see the Russians going? I mean, it did surprise some of us that in the Quadrennial Defense Review, only one mention of Russia, but now we're spending an inordinate amount of money trying to sort of catch up with what they're up to in Crimea, perhaps elsewhere, in terms of causing some inherent hostilities in their region. Where do we stand relative to China and matching their capability? They are doing things with their own aircraft that, to some extent, from what I understand, mirror, I won't say our capabilities, but they have their own fleet, and they're doing some things relative to space architecture, which appear to be fairly modern and innovative. Would you react to that, to what the Chinese are doing specifically?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and let me kind of reference all three domains that the Air Force operates in, airspace and cyber, very briefly. I'll start with cyber. I think everyone's familiar with the activity in the cyber domain over the last number of years. It's getting more significant, not less. We have got to stay abreast or ahead of that activity technologically and capability-wise in the services. We are investing in this budget to try and do that, as is the department. Clearly, that is a driving factor for what we're planning.
We're putting more money in. The President's recommended more money, both for
yes, sir.
For cyber and special operators.
Yes, sir. On the space side, you mentioned the kind of the increased threat to our capability to operate freely in the space domain. We think that will continue to be a problem, and we think it now expands beyond just a low Earth orbit. And so we've got to be worried about how do we maintain situational awareness in space? How do we track objects in space? How do we maneuver, evade in space? Things that our Air Force Space Command has built into our plan here over the next 5 years, because we cannot stop investing in that area. And on the air domain, air forces are successful over time because they stay on the front end of technology. There's some great literature out there about why air forces fail. In fact, that's the title of one book. And typically they fail because they fall behind the technological curve. The Chinese and the Russians are creating capability in the air domain, aircraft, that will be competitive or more capable than our legacy fleets. They just will be. Now, whether we worry about direct confrontation with China or Russia isn't the point. Today, 53 countries around the world fly either Chinese or Russian front-end fighters. And if they follow their typical model and they export these things within 3 to 5 years, we will be facing their equipment within the next 10 years. That's what's driving our insistence on the F-35 as a priority program for the United States Air Force. We need the technical capability it will bring in contested environments and full-spectrum fights. It's not about a counterinsurgency battle. That's not what that airplane's for.
And they, too, are working on a degree of stealth that is we need to be able to contend with.
Yes, sir. We think the Chinese will field it in 2017 or early 18, and the Russians in 2019, and they'll export it 3 to 5 years after that.
Ms. Granger.
Thank you. And thank you both for being so straightforward and talking about what the losses are if we do the lower amount. You know, when sequestration was first talked about, we kept saying, tell us what this means, and we couldn't get that answer. And there are members of Congress who really think it's really not going to hurt that much. It's really going to hurt. And so you've made that you've said that, and I appreciate that. Now, continuing the tradition of asking parochial questions, and I am also shameless about this, but it is important. And General Welsh, we've talked about the CV-22 fleet and the requirement of 50 aircraft. So I have one real simple question. Are you going to replace the 3 that have been essentially lost by combat? And then the other thing is the future of the CV-22. And as they pick up more search and rescue missions and medevac missions, it seemed like it would make sense to use CV-22s as part of the combat rescue helicopter needs. Are you considering that?
Yes, ma'am. To both questions, yes. Congress has already, I believe, appropriated the funding and supported that funding to replace the one training and one combat loss of the CV-22. And so the intent is to get back to the 50 aircraft that we originally had programmed in the budget, and thank you for your support for that. On the combat search and rescue side, even though we are trying very hard to push forward with the combat rescue helicopter program, which we think is part of the fabric of our Air Force, if we're going to send people out the door to go engage in aerial combat, I want to be able to look them in the eye and tell them we're going to come get them if something goes wrong. And the Secretary has kind of stood very firmly behind her decision to push forward with that. And I think that's been wonderful for us. The issue over time is, does the concept of operations change to include CV-22s and the new combat rescue helicopter? We haven't made that decision yet. We will look at it over time because there are some environments the CV-22 lends itself very well to, longer distances, longer legs for rescue operations, et cetera, as we saw in the Libya operation when a great Marine Corps MV-22 crew went and picked up an Air Force F-15E pilot. And so I think we have to continue to evolve the concept of operations.
Good, thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Ryan.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on my last question, so we talked about the backup aircraft, and you were pretty clear you want to get it down to about 8 for each of these bases. So the extra aircraft that aren't going to fit in, we have surplus capacity. Where do those go?
Some of them are not surplus capacity. It's surplus capacity overall. We have more airlift aircraft right now than we believe we need. You'll recall, sir, that in 12 and 13, some force structure actions that we were trying to take were held up because we hadn't done a good job of telling the story to the Congress and making it clear why we were doing this. We believe we have too many C-130s and we have to divest some. We have to retire some.
So how many do you think?
The number is roughly, I can give you the exact numbers, but we have 358 or so now. We think we can go down over near 320, 318 or so in the C-130 fleet. But I'll give you the exact numbers. I've got those buried here somewhere.
And we would still be able to meet our needs
Yes,
with that number?
That's what the latest mobility capability assessment told us. So that's been the goal we've been targeting for the last couple of years.
Okay. Well, I'd love to sit down and dig
Yes,
into
sir.
this a little further.
We'd love to have that chance.
Madam Secretary, continuing the parochialism of the committee today, which is very unusual, must say. We have been blessed with President Obama's first additive manufacturing institute of these 15 institutes he wants to stand up in the field of manufacturing. The top funder for this is the Department of Defense, and they're pursuing research, development, eventually commercialization in additive manufacturing. Phenomenally transformational technology, as I know that you know. One of the collaborations, it's now called America Makes, one of the collaborations that we're proposing and we're having conversation is between America Makes and the Youngstown Reserve Station, but also the Air Force Research Lab in Dayton. And there's an opportunity there, I think, for a real partnership to figure out, as you know, they can print parts for aircraft and to work to develop in Ohio with Dayton, Youngstown, and the America Makes facility to really figure out how we can drive down the costs in the Air Force and other places in the military, but particularly in the Air Force, to drive down the costs of component parts manufacturing. So I would just like to bring that to your attention and have you comment on it if you'd like. General, you can comment on it as well, to just look at the possibilities we have. I mean, this is the idea of the Institute. Mr. Chairman, I think this can be huge all across the military. We look at the amount of money we spend on replacement parts and whatnot. If we can start printing these parts ourselves in-house without transportation costs or any of the other necessary things that we need to do, I think it could be huge. So if you could just comment on that and at least consider what we're proposing with the relationship between Dayton and Youngstown State and the other relationships that we'd like to put together.
So, Congressman, I'm not familiar with this program, but I'd like to learn more about it. As you said, it sounds very exciting, and it's certainly, you know, my 3 priorities, and number 3, I said, is make every dollar count and look for ways to do things smarter and better and save money. So I would love to learn more about it.
And maybe you can come out and see it.
I would love to.
Congressman, we
It's a
actually
good
have been-
invitation.
have been looking at this a little bit. And Air Mobility Command, for example, is a big fan of the idea, because if you can laser print parts in the back of a C-17 by carrying a portable laser with you when you deploy somewhere, you might not have to have as many problems with picking up parts along the route in the system. For those who deploy to remote locations, it's even more important. Air Force Special Operations Command and others who operate their C-130s and other aircraft in places where there is no rapid FedEx access. And so we have been looking at this. Air Force Material Command and actually Air Force Research Labs have been looking hard at this with your teams at Dayton, as you mentioned. This is a really ripe area for further research.
Well, great. Well, we'd love your support on this. I think it'd be huge, and I think it, as I said, drive down the costs and increase convenience a great deal, so we'd appreciate your support on that.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Judge Carter, welcome. I know you've been sharing with the committee, the other committee on which I serve, and I apologize for my absence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. I have been chairing Homeland, and it's still ongoing. One quick question: how are we working out on our joint contract, getting our C-130s for the Coast Guard? They're working with the Air Force on a project. When can we anticipate? You know, one C-130 means a whole lot more to us than it does to the Air Force. You got any idea what the time frame is?
I should, because I was just told this about 3 weeks ago. The program is on schedule. It's on track. Bob Papp and I talked about this not long ago. It's exactly where we want it to be. I don't remember the dates, sir, and that's my fault. Let me get it for you.
Well, let me know, because
we'll get it.
as I walked out the door, they said, ask about our C-130s. Okay, Secretary James, according to the Defense News article, the cancellation of the F-16 Combat Avionics Program Extension System, CAPES, is one of the largest cost-cutting measures the Air Force is requesting. This program would upgrade 300 U.S. Air Force F-16s. Part of the CAPES program also included upgrades to 146 F-16s in Taiwan. Taiwan claims that the U.S. is not being upfront on the cost that they would be burdened with to upgrade their F-16 fleet if the CAPES program is zeroed out. As a co-chair of the Taiwan caucus, I take great interest in this particular matter. Has the Air Force found a way to fund CAPES upgrades for F-16s in Taiwan? What liabilities will Taiwan face if Congress approved to eliminate the CAPES upgrade for the F-16? Taiwan's Minister of National Defense claims the U.S. Air Force officials are not providing them with information they need to take the appropriate action. Can you please elaborate on this and explain the actions your service has to alleviate the issue?
So, Congressman Carter, you're right. CAPES was one of the decisions that the Air Force made to try to meet the affordability targets. It saves us about $2 billion over the 5-year plan, just to give you an order of magnitude there. My information, so I'm going to have to now go back and look into your information there, but my information was, of course, we did inform Taiwan, and we don't believe that it will be, significant additional dollars for them as a result of this. But I heard what you just said, and I'm going to have to take that back unless the chief has anything to add at this point, but that's a little different from the information I had.
Same thing, ma'am. We don't think there's an increase to their top-line cost at all. And we do believe they've been notified, so we need to go check this.
Well, I want it clarified. When I was in Taiwan in October, everybody, including the cab drivers, were telling me that they needed their F-16s. They worry, and they're worrying even more now that there seems to be a trend of the big boys pushing the little boys around coming our way, and they're worried about it. So, do I have time for another question?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know y'all have had a little discussion about the A-10, but I want to ask you some more things about the A-10. First off, I have, as my office manager in my office, a former Army Command Sergeant Major, and he and many, many, many other Army people tell me that nothing makes a soldier smile brighter than a warthog coming over the horizon, because they do a fantastic job in the enclosed, personal, where the Army needs it. And so from the standpoint of the ordinary soldier, the loss of that A-10 is a big deal, because they really see that as he just smiled at me. He said, when they fire that cannon all the way, they almost stop dead still in the air. It's got so much force, and we love that thing.
That might not be a strength of the airplane.
He says they're tough enough, you can't shoot them down. That's what he said. These guys, the Army's guys, they love the A-10. But back to the more important thing. It was designed primarily as a tank killer, and a very effective tank killer, and we were looking at using it on the battlefields of Central Europe. Well, as we sit here today, 20,000 Russian troops are sitting on the border of the Ukraine, and it's not beyond our imagination that we're going to be needing to kill tanks sometime in the future. So as we eliminate this effective tank killing airplane, what are we doing to cover these main risks that are associated with retiring the A-10s? Was the plan to retire A-10s coordinated with the Army? What is the plan for the A-10 divestment? Will these aircraft be put in storage? What is the prospect for our allies taking A-10? What would the Air Force do if Congress mandated retention of the A-10 fleet? What will be used to fill the close air support CAS missions currently filled by A-10? Are you confident these platforms will be able to fill the other roles? And finally, you've stated the A-10 only provides around 20% of the CAS missions. How is that number calculated?
I was going to start, and Congressman, I just returned from Afghanistan, so I too was trying to get every ground commander that I could ask this very question about the A-10s. And as you point out, it is a very beloved aircraft, and nobody likes the idea of retiring it. But you also just mentioned this 80%, 20% split. So. And the chief will tell you how it's calculated, but this is an important point, that there are other aircraft. Well, let me back up. A-10, or close air support, is a mission. It's not a platform. So there are F-16s and F-15Es and some of our unmanned vehicles and bombers. Others do the close air support mission as well. In fact, 80% of the mission in Afghanistan was done by aircraft other than the A-10, and 20% was done by the A-10. So to answer a couple of your questions, the plan is to divest it over 5 years, so it's not overnight, it's gradual over 5 years. The plan at the moment is to fully retire them, so not to transfer them to other countries. If there would be other countries interested, I suppose that would be an idea. It was coordinated with the Army, and as you say, the Army loves the A-10, but what the Army really needs from us is the commitment for close air support, and they have that commitment, absolutely. It's a sacred mission. So those are a couple points I wanted to add in.
Sorry, I have a son who's a Marine Corps infantry officer. He tells me the same things about the A-10. The CAS is not an afterthought for the United States Air Force. Certainly isn't one for me, and it will not be in the future. We've been doing close air support for a long time in the United States Air Force, in a major way since World War II. It's not going to slow down. We're not going to change, but we're going to do less of it, just like we're going to do less interdiction, less air superiority, less ISR, less everything with these funding levels. And so we had to look at how do you save big chunks of money. And that's where this came from. It's not really about the A-10. It's about balance in what an air commander provides a ground commander. The A-10 does close air support. The other airplanes we're talking about, F-16s, F-15Es, the B-1, they do other things besides close air support in an uncontested environment as we've had in Afghanistan. For the last 14 years, all we've done that's gotten anybody's attention is close air support. So people don't understand the value of the rest of it in a large fight. But where you save the most lives for a ground commander, if you're an air commander, is by providing air superiority so they have freedom to maneuver and freedom to attack, by interdicting the enemy's will to continue the fight, by destroying leadership, command and control, logistics infrastructure, reinforcement ability from the rear areas, by eliminating the enemy's second echelon forces, particularly their operational reserve, which is the Army commander's biggest concern. Do not let them commit their reserve at a time and place of their choosing. They don't do that against us because we erased their operational reserve. That's where air forces save big lives on the battlefield. And then we have to do close air support well. We do it well with lots of airplanes. The A-10 was designed, optimized with great help from Congress over the last 20, 25 years to be superb at this mission. But we're very good at it with other platforms. I don't want to give up the A-10. But if you look at what the trades are, you mentioned what's the backup plan, it's giving up the capability to do those other things. That's not acceptable.
And I understand the big picture of what the Air Force provides. The real key to the world is control of the air. especially in a tank battle. If you don't control the air, you're dead. But then in turn, this was designed specifically, and I'm no military expert, believe me, I just read a lot of books. But in Korea, for instance, the F-86, the ground forces discovered that the F-86 went too fast to be effectively low in protecting them, so they brought in P-51s.
And
they
F-84s.
used and they used them very effectively because they said they come by too fast. They're not as good as, it's not getting in close and personal like they had experienced just in the war 8 years ago.
The judge is well read, General.
So, and I just want to make sure that because the old Warthog is a slow, lumbering, big fortress that comes in and wreaks havoc, and it gets big holes shot in it. I'm aware of that. But it also certainly it makes individual soldiers light up with a smile when
Sir,
it comes
I have
in.
a lot of time flying the A-10. I
I think the general's well aware of our keen interest in it.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Crenshaw and then Mr. Cole.
I'm going to ask a question about the nuclear missile officer scandal, and want to point out that's not a parochial issue. It happened a long way from Florida, but it raised some serious questions about quality of life. Pointed out the fact that a lot of people are places where they don't necessarily want to be, and so I'm wondering what your plans are to make sure you have your personnel where they want to be, and in a program like this, how you plan on maintaining that as a career field.
So in the wake of this incident, which I've been on the job for 3 months, I think this happened when I had been on the job for either 2 or 3 weeks, both the chief and I went out to the missile bases to sort of directly try to get to the bottom of what was going on there. And we both came back with impressions. There were 7 impressions. I won't run through all of them with you, but I'll just give you a few. That there is something systemic going on, that the cheating was only in this one base, but there were systemic morale issues, there were systemic cultural issues, I'll say, at all of the locations, and that part of the solution, or I should say the solution needs to be holistic, not just talking about cheating. If all you care about is the cheating, you can proctor the tests differently and just take care of that and be done. But really, it's more of a holistic approach. So we've had these 2 quick studies going on, one called the Commander-Directed Investigation, and one is called the Force Improvement Plan. These are coming together, and among other things, these are going to talk about people issues and what do we need to do for morale and professional development and the consideration of accolades and awards and incentives and so forth. So I think we're very close. By the way, we owe the Secretary of Defense a report within 60 days, as did the Navy. He got together all of us in the Department of Defense to focus on the nuclear mission generally. And so our reports are almost coming due, and so we will have more to share on all of this. But main point is it will be holistic, it will be very people-focused, and I think we're also going to address this testing and training environment, which at least struck me as being unhealthy when I saw it. The nuclear mission, by the way, is safe and secure. I wanted to say that. There's a lot of checks and balances.
I think that's important. I think you've done it publicly, reassured us, and actually, you and I first became acquainted soon after your appointment, and I had 2 calls from you. And certainly the committee has a keen interest. I think the public, as we discussed sort of before the meeting, is unaware of your historic responsibilities. In this regard, I think they need to have a better awareness. But if you continue to have those responsibilities, we need to have that assurance which you've given us. That safety is first here. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having drug us down into shamelessly parochial issues, which seems to be the phrase of the day, I'm going to avoid that, although I am going to ask you a question for the records. I just want to alert you on C-130 avionics modernization program, which you've zeroed out, and frankly, where I think the Air Force is sort of, well, not sort of, I think has pretty much ignored congressional intent for 2 or 3 years. So I'm going to ask a pretty pointed question about why. But I want to actually go back to much bigger issues, and you've both touched on them in your testimony. A few years ago, when General Welsh was sitting in your chair and was briefing this committee, with very justifiable pride about what his airmen had done the year before, and he ticked off, he said, we've been in combat operations in Iraq, done a wonderful job, been in combat operations in Afghanistan, done a terrific job, unexpectedly were called upon to provide support to an important friend and ally in Japan during a national disaster that they had, and then with 6 days warning conducted an air war over Libya that, we can debate the wisdom of the war, but I don't think you can debate the success of the effort, and which was pretty magnificent. So, and I asked him, and he was warning us about sequester then. I said, or this was even pre-sequester. I said, given where we're going on our budget, tell me if you can do that for another president 2 or 3 years down the road. He said, no, we will not have the capability. We can probably do 2 of these things, maybe on a stretch 3, but we certainly couldn't do all of them again with the kind of force reductions that we're looking at. And this is pre-sequester. These were, first round of cuts. So I'm going to pose the same question looking forward to you. We've made you both make a lot of very tough decisions that I know you didn't want to make, but I do think we're in danger of leaving the next commander-in-chief, whoever that happens to be, with a lot fewer options and capabilities than our commanders-in-chief have traditionally enjoyed in the last couple of decades or really longer. So if you look ahead, you've told us you're going to do the best with what you have, and I have no doubt that you will. Tell us a little bit in 2 or 3 years, if you can do it either, well, both would be better, in a sequester scenario or a non-sequester scenario, but just sort of steady state funding. What kind of capabilities will the president have in a crisis situation? What are the things he can do? What are the number of different contingencies if he had to face multiple contingencies, and they all do at some point? What's he going to have to say, no, we can't do that anymore? Or that's one where, we're just out of here.
Why don't you go ahead?
Congressman, it's kind of the key question for service chiefs and for combatant commanders as they try and advise the chairman, the Secretary of Defense, and the president. We are going to be able to do less, clearly, which means that we have to look at it in terms of the defense strategy we have today. If we return to sequestered funding levels and maintain that through the rest of this 5-year defense plan and beyond, we will not be able to execute the defense strategy the way it's written. All the service chiefs, I believe, are in full agreement on that. Even short of that, however, if there are adjustments made, as you've done in the balanced budget agreement for the first couple of years here, if more adjustments are made along those lines, we still will have to be doing less, because we are still putting a lot less on our top line than we had planned to have on our top line even 2 or 3 years ago. And so the ability of the nation to present options to the president on how to use the military instrument of national power are going to be more limited. You can't continue to stay involved everywhere we're involved and add new contingencies. You won't have the capacity. And in this business, quantity does have a quality all its own. You could have the best tanker in the world, but if you only got one of them, you're not refueling in 2 oceans. And so there's some of this you've just got to have in the back of your mind as you look at options for the nation to get engaged.
I would just reiterate the point that that higher level over the 5 years will put us in a much better position than that sequestration level. We do feel, bottom line, that sequestration level will compromise our security too much.
Well, I just want to thank you both for making the point, because I think it is, as my colleague Ms. Granger mentioned, it's a point we need to make over and over for the American people, and frankly for the Congress, much more specifically, that these things do have real live consequences, and we really are going to have commanders-in-chief that are not going to be able to do what we've traditionally thought American presidents could do and should be able to do, not only for this country but for other countries around the world in terms of our total security. So I mean, it's real stuff we're playing with. It's not just, my AWACS versus his tankers versus, an A-10. It really is less capability for the country and for the president at a time of crisis. So,
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Points well taken. Mr. Visklowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, do you have any thoughts on how to formalize a process in conjunction with the Nuclear Weapons Council, Department of Defense, and NNSA?
Beyond the current process, I'm assuming you mean?
Right.
Sir. Yeah, I think this is one that we actually work pretty hard. There are different factors driving everybody's decisions, obviously, as you move across government agencies. And the biggest problem we have within NSA, and problem is probably the wrong word, the biggest tension we have is trying to balance our modernization plans with things like the B-61, for example, with their modernization plans for things like the B-61. When we're working common programs, we have to make sure that our plans are closely aligned, because if one side or the other deviates from the plan, the funding becomes inefficient, the program gets put at risk, and certainly falls behind timelines. So we're trying to do that at every level, from the program office up to the commander of Air Force Global Strike Command. It's one of the reasons that our predecessors put in place a directorate on the air staff responsible for only nuclear matters to help us in that debate within the department and across departmental lines every single day.
And I know what the answer should be, and I'm not asking it to put you on the spot or be trite, but both the chairman and I have chaired the Energy and Water Subcommittee. I've been ranking on the committee. Mr. Calvert serves on it today, Ms. Capter does, which I think is very, very healthy because of the coordination of the two subcommittees in their jurisdiction. I was always under the impression that DOD may not give as much thought as possible to all of the cost implications to the NNSA and Department of Energy as to what their needs are. Well, we need it, but it's in NNSA's budget. It's not on my line. I need it. Would you just address that, if you could? This is a care or lack thereof?
Yes, sir. I would say you're a smart guy, and we probably ought to go look at that concern. I don't know how I would stand on that. I don't know the history behind this. I'd have to go take a look at this and advise the boss on where we think this stands. But I can certainly understand what you're saying the problem could be. I don't know if it's a problem today or not. I'd be making up an answer, sir.
And you mentioned the B-61, and do have a question on that. In earlier testimony on the 15 budget, you reaffirmed the Air Force's commitment to making the F-35 a dual-capable aircraft, that is, conventional, non-conventional weapons. And there is a request for $15.6 million in the budget to study and analyze the fielding of the B-61 on the F-35. There is also a quarter of the request for $198.4 million for the life extension program for the B-61, for the integration and modernization of these gravity bombs for a variant to be placed on the F-15 and the F-16. If the F-35 is going to represent the sizable portion of the Air Force, and we are going to spend money as far as, if you would, matching up the gravity bomb and the F-35, it's a lot of money for another variant of a nuclear weapon on a plane that is going to see less and less use. And I'm wondering, from a cost-effective standpoint, is that a wise decision to spend all that money on a variant for an aircraft that's seen better days?
It's a great question, sir. The F-35 is not yet nuclear capable. The F-16 and F-15E are. As we do the transition between the platforms, I don't know what's going to happen to funding for the DCA capability on the F-35 over time. I just don't know. The hedge is the F-15E. So the F-16 is more of a near-term problem. When the B-61 first releases, will we still have some F-16s doing the DCA mission? We think that's possible. Therefore, we've planned to make sure they were capable of doing the mission. The policy decision is that we will support the mission. Now, we don't make that decision. The F-15E will be capable through the early 2030s to support the mission, and that's kind of our hedge for the transition into the F-35. So as the F-35 comes on board, gets to full operational capability, and we start to actually do the transition to the F-35 being a DCA platform, if that remains the policy decision of the nation, then during that time period, the F-15E will be here to ensure we can continue the DCA mission until we can make the transition. That's all this is intended to be.
I do have concerns simply because if we're talking about life extension program, it's not something that's done tomorrow. In a sense, there's some concurrency as far as the two tracks of the F-35 downward slope, and the taxpayers are spending a lot of money on doing two life extension programs for a gravity bomb that probably, as we proceed with the arsenal, is going to also see, from a numerical standpoint, a smaller portion. It's a lot of money.
Yes, sir. The timeline for right now, we still believe the first production unit of the B-61 of the bomb assembly being developed by DOE will come out in about 20 or so, late 2019, early 2020. And if that's the case, we do not believe that F-35 will be involved in the DCA mission yet at that point.
I think it's necessary.
Is what necessary, sir?
That if you have a gap, if you would, do you think that is a critical gap?
Not if the airplane that we have that's available today to fly the mission in support of NATO, for example, can carry the weapon. That's the integration with the F-15E and the F-16. They're the airplanes doing it today.
Okay. If I could, the Air Force, and apparently has been very successful, has an efficient space procurement program. Apparently, those processes are going to be applied to a space modernization initiative. And I guess the question I have, has the efficient space procurement program gone away? And are we taking the lessons learned to a new initiative? Or are we going to now have two different initiatives?
No, sir, I don't think so. I think
That wasn't confidence building.
she is remarkably able to send thoughts my way.
Yeah.
And her throat is bothering her right now, so I'll answer this.
I've been there once today already.
Yeah. I'll make just a completely aside comment here. I have never worked with somebody who picks things up as fast as my new boss does, which is going to be remarkably good for this committee, I believe, and for the Air Force.
I'll give you your money later, General Welsh.
You make a pretty good team. But we were watching your body language very carefully.
She's making me study. The efficient space procurement strategy really is formed on four principal points, and I'll make sure I say them right. Stable R&D funding, block buys, fiscal authorities that allow you to maintain a smooth spending profile, fixed price contracts, and then should cost reviews throughout the life of a program. And I think we're talking about the same thing, sir. I don't think that is any different than the focus areas you're talking about now.
Do you know if there is a charter or any type of document that the committee could have for the record relative to the initiation of the Space Modernization Initiative? And if not,
yes,
if
sir.
you could, for the record, answer that.
Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Let me associate, as we say, myself with the ranking of our interest in getting more information on both of those questions and points he's raised. Getting back to the tankers again, General, I just want to somewhat put a question into the record. As you know, General Welsh, the Air Force operates 5 dozen KC tankers out of Travis Air Force Base on the West Coast and Joint Base McGuire on the East Coast. The Air Force has suggested that if a sequestration returns in fiscal year 2015, it'll retire the entire fleet of KC-10 extenders. I'm aware of the Air Force's argument that it saves more money to retire the entire airframe because you do not have to maintain the schoolhouse, the maintenance systems, the logistics tail. But how much service life is left on these KC-10s?
So this wouldn't be a retirement because we can't extend it longer. It can extend longer. The question is just where do you take the cuts from? It's back to the balance discussion. And when we did our operational analysis, we determined that the KC-10 would be the next fleet that would make the most operational sense to retire if you had to retire something. There are no good answers.
But tell me if I'm wrong. The KC-10 is the only aircraft that has both the boom and the basket to refuel.
Until the KC-46 starts feeling in 2016.
It's still going to be the aircraft of choice.
Yes, sir. The KC-46 will provide that capability, but the issue for us is number of booms, not just how good each boom is. And so if we take the number of KC-135s away that could pay the same bill, we cannot support the global mission. If we take the KC-10 fleet away, even though we don't want to, you can do the mission, it will just put more strain on it.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman, could I also say that's an FY16 issue. So under no circumstances would we do this in FY15. But if sequestration returned those levels, if we have to live with those levels, then
We're going to do our level best to make sure that sequestration does not return. I think on behalf of all of our members, I want to thank you for your testimony, Madam Secretary. General Welsh, appreciate your being here. We do have a number of questions for the record, and if you could expedite responses, we would appreciate it. The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.
thank you.